So we are so excited tonight. I'm excited to have this conversation with someone I really admire and really enjoy talking to. John Pipkin is the director of the Undergraduate Creative Writing Program at UT Austin. Originally from Baltimore, he received a Ph.D. in English from Rice University. His first novel, Woodsburner, won the New York Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, the Massachusetts Center for the Book Novel Prize, and the Texas Institute of Letters Stephen Turner Prize. His second novel, The Blind Astronomer's Daughter, was named Book of the Month by the London Times. It's a wonderful book. John has received fellowships from MacDowell, Yaddo, and Dobie-Paisano, and he's currently completing a novel about the Tour de France during World War II, which you would have heard a little bit of if you were at our one-page salon a couple months ago. So everybody in the chat box, in your best way possible in these pandemic, socially distant times, welcome John Pipkin. Welcome, John. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
We're glad to have ya. Okay, so we, you know, the Ask Us Anything, the idea behind this program, which we've done a number of these. Look at all the love you're getting in the chat box. Which we've done a number of these at this point. We like to pick one topic that we think we have a burning feeling people are going to have questions about. Then we invite someone that we like who knows how to answer questions to join us. And we go for it. So we ask everybody to send in questions ahead of time, which a lot of you did, and we've selected sort of we've selected a really nice assortment of questions. And then we also really want you to feel free to ask questions in the chat box. If we don't answer them immediately, we will get to them at some point. Is there a live John? I don't know what that means, but we will, oh, you know what? I think it's because I'm sharing the screen. So you guys are gonna wanna go to gallery view or just ignore, somehow get out of the screen share. You're only gonna see who's talking. So for now you're seeing me, but yes, there is a live John. He is, John, say something.
Hey.
He's live and he's here. So we've collected the questions. I've put them in an order in terms of topic or theme, and we're just going to dive in and then throw up some questions in the chat box, and it's going to be a great time. So the first thing I wanted to do is just take a moment and define what we're talking about. And, you know, we called this session Ask Us Anything critique partners, but there really are a lot of different ways that you can share your work and get feedback, and one-on-one partnership isn't necessarily the only way, and we do want to open the conversation up more broadly. But this question I thought we would start with. So please give us a level set. How do you distinguish between a critique partner, a beta reader, and an editor? John Pipkin, what do you think of that question?
You know, when you sent me that question earlier, I was wondering, I'd never really heard the phrase beta reader. So I actually don't make a distinction between different levels of feedback until I get to the editor. So I guess if I can start backwards and then work my way up.
Yeah, you know, actually, before we dive into this question, actually, why don't you take a minute and just talk about, as a writer, because you've written 2 wonderful novels, and you know you've written another one now that you're getting ready to sort of hand off, I imagine. But what is your process in terms of sharing your material and receiving feedback? And then from the other side of it, can you just talk a little bit about your own experience reading material and offering feedback? And that might be a good way for us to just begin the conversation.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think like everyone, and of course, well, I think the first thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about what kind of feedback you want and what kind of feedback you need is that it's actually a very personal question. There's no objective standard for what kind of feedback you need to get and who you should get it from and when you should get it. It's a very personal thing. And so I think it's important to understand first what kind of a writer you are. And I mean that in terms of your process, what your process is as a writer to be able to understand what kind of feedback you need or you want, or what's most going to be most beneficial for you. So in my case, for example, you know, I know, you know, lots of writers who say do kind of chapter by chapter feedback with a one-on-one writing partner or critique partner. Or, you know, I know writers who work, say, in a writing group where they meet once a month, and every month they look at someone else's chapter. And so they sort of move through chapter by chapter. But I sort of fall into the category of I don't like to show anyone anything until I've worked through several layers of revision and have the manuscript to a point where I've taken it as far as I can take it without feedback. So for example, in the book I'm working on right now, I've been working on it for about 4 years. I finished the first rough draft about 2 years ago. I'm working on the third level of revision. So after the rough draft, I then went back and rewrote everything. Then I rearranged it, rewrote it again, and now I'm rewriting it for the third time. And I'm almost done with this third set of full rewrites. And this is the point at which I'm ready to show it to someone. And so again, this becomes very personal. And the reason why I tend to work that way is I like to be able to make the mistakes that I need to make on my own. And so, okay, yeah.
Well, I'm just wondering, did you learn that from experience? Meaning, how did you get to that point? What advice would you have for writers who are listening to figure out which kind of writer they are?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, when I was first started writing years ago, but not my first novel, but the first attempt at writing a novel, I wanted immediate feedback. Like I'd write a few pages and I wasn't quite certain whether what I had written was novel material or not. So I would show it to people and I would get feedback from people about these pages, but I was going in small chunks. So it was, you know, here are 10 pages. What do you think? Here's a chapter. What do you think? And what I think what I was really looking for was not feedback, but validation. I just wanted someone to tell me, like, it's okay. You're doing okay. Keep going. And one of the things that I found was, and again, this is very subjective, and it's very different for every writer. But for me, I found that if someone made a comment or a critique that was valid, but that stopped me from pursuing something I was doing. Say I was heading in a direction that was not something that would ultimately be a productive direction for the novel. Someone would say, yeah, I wouldn't do this, or you're going to write yourself into a corner. Well, I would stop doing that. But then what I came to realize is that sometimes you have to write yourself into a corner. You have to go down that dark alley that's not going to lead anywhere in order to explore that dark alley and get a deeper sense of your characters. And then you've got to come out of the alley and go someplace else. But that's...
I love that you're saying that, though. I think there's a couple things that are really such a great way to start this conversation. First of all, before you learn, you know, what a critique partner is and what that relationship looks like, figure out when, you know, what kind of writer you are and if that relationship is actually what you need, or if it's going to benefit you. And I also have seen with other writers and also with myself that exactly what you just described, that idea that you think you want to share pages because you want feedback, but what you really want is the validation. And so understanding what it is you're needing, and then understanding a little bit more, you know, and we're going to dive into that tonight, what these different relationships can be, I think is important. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah,
so go ahead.
I would say by validation, it's not only the validation of someone telling you, oh, you're great, but more that sense of, this is a very immature approach to writing, that sense of, I don't want to be wasting my time. Yeah. I want to make sure, but you have to waste time. I mean, that's, I would say 50% of the writing I do on any individual novel is wasted time, in the sense that it winds up on the floor. It's not material that I'm going to use, but you have to you have to be willing to commit to that. And I found one of the other things, and then I'll stop talking, is that
no, you're here to talk.
like one of the things that one of the reasons why I realized I was going out too early is I found myself early on getting frustrated, right? Getting annoyed by critiques that I was getting that were valid, that were good critiques, but I was thinking, oh, but you don't understand, this character is going to go on in the next chapter to do this thing. And then I began to realize, well, then I should wait until I get to the next chapter and do this, rather than asking people to look at raw material that's not cooked yet, that's really not ready to be read. You have to get there first, which means you have to make a lot of mistakes on your own and figure things out on your own and get the manuscript to a draft that's ready to be read. It's still a draft. It's not like it's perfect, but it's at that stage where it can be read, and you're not in a position of getting defensive or thinking, oh, no, but when if you're still at that stage, but I'm going to get there. Wait till you get there and then show it.
So then when you're at that stage for you, what does that look like? Because I know you told me that you actually don't work with one particular person, so you don't have a critique partner in your life as a writer, but who do you share it with?
It changes every time. So, for me, again, and I'm going to keep saying this over and over again because I feel like this is so very personal and so subjective.
Sure.
Everybody works in a different way, and everybody follows a different process. And there's no right way or wrong way. There's just the way that works for you as a writer.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes you figure out that way by hearing other people talk about their way and saying like, that would not be my way. Or, wow, I'd love to try that. Yeah, for sure.
No, because when I hear people who have a group that meets every month and they work chapter by chapter, I'm actually kind of jealous. I would love to work that way. It just doesn't work for me to work that way. When I know I'm ready to show it to someone when I've done everything I can possibly do on my own. So the state of my manuscript right now, for example, the one I've been working on for about 4 years now, it's still got problems and holes and flaws in it, but I know where they are. And so it would be, like in some ways, I feel like it would be inconsiderate of someone else's time to say, look at this malformed thing that I've produced and tell me what you think. Because I know there are sort of strong points, but there are weak points. And so I want to make sure that I address all of the issues that I can identify on my own before I show it to other readers to look at. And so I work in a method that I work in, as I've mentioned before, is I tend to write multiple interwoven narratives. And so I'll write each narrative from start to finish first, and then go back and break them apart and interweave them and then rewrite everything. And so I'm at that stage right now. And once I finish with that, then I'll probably give it to 2 or 3 different people to read. But they're different every time because it depends on what I'm writing and who I think would be the readers that are, who would sort of write in that vein, who write in that genre and would have a sense of where problems might be or where there might be flaws that need to be addressed.
When you say readers, do you mean readers who are writers, or do you mean readers?
I mean who are writers.
Yeah. So I think that kind of circles us back in some ways to this question, because the level set of how you distinguish between a critique partner, a beta reader, and an editor, I would say, in a simplistic way, that a critique partner is somebody often who is going to look at the work from a writer's point of view. So they're not necessarily someone who just happens to read a lot of what you're writing, but they are a writer who understands craft and who's going to probably be able to give you some craft, some sort of craft feedback that's going to be valuable. A beta reader, what I've thought of a beta reader, and I really appreciate that Tipo is adding stuff to to the chat, because I imagine there are different ways that we define this, but I've always thought of a beta reader as someone who actually reads something more from the reader's point of view, meaning they probably they should be in the genre you're writing in. They should be someone who understands the expectations of the genre. They should be pretty well read in that genre, and they're really coming at it from a more of an entertainment or, expectation reading point of view than they are from a craft point of view, if that makes sense. But I think it can change depending on who you're talking to. An editor would be a professional who you would either pay to do developmental or editorial work before you go to an agent or a publishing house, or an editor is someone inside a publishing house who is also paid to then, sort of final stage of the process, take the book where it needs to go in order for it to be ready for publication. So I hope that's helpful, but I think that one of the things that we're learning is probably that there are a lot of terms out there that there's not necessarily one standard final definition for, but for the point of tonight, we're talking about writers sharing their work with other writers, and we're focusing on the critique partner piece of this, or critique groups, writing groups, that sort of thing. Okay. So I think we've sort of talked a little about this. What are the advantages of having a critique partner for feedback rather than a writing group, and vice versa? And, I don't know what you would say to this, John. I think my first reaction is, because it's a different style. Do you want to be sharing feedback, sharing your work with one person, or do you want to share it with an entire group of people? Do you want feedback from one person, or do you want feedback from 6 or 7 or 8 other people, or 4 people, depending on the size of your group? But in terms of the advantages, I think there can be pros and cons to both. What do you think, John?
Yeah, I agree. And again, I think it comes back to it being a very personal issue in terms of what you need as a writer. I've been seeing in the chat group, the chat box, the importance of having a community to work with, to having people who are encouraging you, keeping you moving forward, keeping you motivated. And so I think it depends on, again, what your needs are as a writer. I also have friends who are writers who we just kind of want to close the door and hide in a corner and be left alone, right? To write for months and months and months. But that's a certain personality profile, so it really depends on what you need to help you, support you as a writer. Do you need peace and quiet and to be left alone and in isolation for a long period of time, in which case the pandemic is like this incredible gift, or do you need communication and feedback and community, in a sense of support that you're working with in a group, and again, those are really less sort of professional issues than sort of personality-based issues. Like, how do you thrive as a writer? What are you looking for in terms of working one-on-one with someone, or working in isolation for a while and then getting feedback, or working in a group through the whole process?
Yeah, so sort of starting with the personality, I think I'm going to assume that the majority of people who are here tonight feel like they want to be engaging with someone for something. And maybe what we're trying to do is dig down a little deeper and figure out what that thing might be for you by talking about all the different options. So yeah, because I've seen also in the chat a lot of conversation about accountability, and I have a friend that for a while, every day we would email each other and say, I wrote 500 words today. And so knowing that she was going to email me and then I was going to email her, I know that we kept each other accountable in some way, but we weren't sharing pages, we weren't taking it that far. It was so nice to know there was another human being out in the world that was wondering if I had gotten my writing done, and currently I'm in a writing group. So meet every week or so with friends, and we're on Zoom, but we turn our cameras off and our microphones off, and we just spend time writing. And we don't ask to see any material, and we, don't do anything other than know that there are other people out there for that period of time who are doing the same thing we are. So there's all sorts of different ways to form it. And Tifo is active in the chat box describing many of them that I've never heard of. So I would for sure check those out. All right, so should I do it? And we've sort of touched on this a little bit too. I love sharing my work with anyone, including strangers and acquaintances, but when I'm in workshops with people I don't know, at some moments I have the inner fear of my work being plagiarized or parts of it being copied. I know this is probably not too much of a necessary concern, but how do I address it? So I guess I would ask you this, John, because you do lead a lot of workshops, and your experience with that sort of group dynamic of exchanging work with multiple people, not necessarily being that familiar with those people. Mm-hmm. What is your answer to this question?
I've never been worried about that, and I think it's primarily because I really think when we're talking about writing, it all comes down to execution. And so, someone might steal your idea. I guess that's possible. I've never worried about anybody taking one of my ideas and running off with them, usually because I just assume my ideas are so obscure, who else would possibly want to write about them? But, I think that it really comes down to, I don't know, just feeling confident in yourself as a writer, knowing that there's no one else who can tell the story that you want to tell in the way that you're going to tell it. And so, even if, which I feel like is doubtful, but even if someone heard the idea for your story and thought, oh, I'm going to run off and write that story, they're not going to do it as well as you will. Like this is not their story. They don't have the same vision that you have. And I think in a real world perspective, ideas do circulate. And I remember when when my last book came out, about 2 months before, which William Herschel, the 18th century astronomer, was a character in that book. About 2 months before it came out, I saw a book on the bookshelf in Book People that had just come out about William Herschel and Carolyn Herschel. I think it was called the Stargazer's Daughter or something like that. And
oh boy,
I was sort of shocked. Like, you gotta be kidding me. But the idea wasn't stolen. It's just all of the ideas, no matter how original you think your idea is, all these ideas are out there in the world, circulating all the time. So even if you take an idea and keep it very close to you, there's a good chance somebody else is out there writing about that idea already. But they're not going to do it in the same way you are. So
right. So to take this question like really literally though, have you ever in your years of doing workshops heard of somebody truly pulling word for word material from someone's piece and plagiarizing it, using it elsewhere?
No.
Because I haven't either. And I think it's something that I'm sure has happened in the world, but I think that the excitement or the positive that you get from sharing your work in a workshop, if it's a workshop that you trust, meaning you came to it in a way that felt, trustworthy, then I think that outweighs this real concern.
Yeah, I should give a more positive answer to that, which is that, yeah, when in all the workshops I've run, whether they've been undergraduate workshops, MFA workshops, or the Writers League workshops with sort of adult community workshops, the energy is so positive. I mean, everyone is there to support everyone else and to really honestly want to help each other through that workshop. And so I'm sure it's a possibility, but I've never encountered a workshop in which there was someone there with some nefarious purpose or someone who would actually take someone else's idea and steal it and try to pass it off as their own. So yeah. That's yeah, that
I wouldn't worry about it. I wouldn't worry about it in the way that it sounds like you're worrying about it. And I also would not suggest that you go into it with any sort of, you know, legal agreement that you expect writers to sign if you're going to send them your pages, because in the same way that an agent wouldn't sign that when you submit your entire manuscript to them, I wouldn't expect that you'd get, you know, too much of a positive response in terms of just a writing group. So then when is the right time? And this is, I know, very subjective, but, you know, a couple of the questions. Do I have to wait until I have a lot written before I go looking and asking for a critique partner? Would you suggest engaging in critique during the writing process or after a work is complete? And it sounds like for you, John, it's after the work is complete, but also like after it's complete and you've done your own edits on it as much as, you know, you're going to do until you know you're just at a point where you need someone else's eye on it, right? Mm-hmm. And then again, it comes back to, you know, what you need. I believe, and I am a part of a critique group as well, and we only meet when somebody has a full draft ready to share, and we read that person's draft. And so it's not on any sort of timetable. It's not every 3 months we're going to read something. I don't know the last time we read something, honestly. But every once in a while, someone will pop up and say, okay, my manuscript is ready, and we will read it and get together at the assigned time. And it is always a full draft. But absolutely, there are groups that get together and share pages along the way. So figuring out yourself, guys, that's going to be the theme for tonight. Figuring out yourself. Who you are. Who are you? How do you find the right fit? All right. I love this question. Should your critique partner be writing the same form and genre of writing? What do you think, John?
Yeah, again, I think it depends, you know, it depends on the genre. You know, certainly if you're writing something very genre specific, like fantasy, for example, I think you want to make sure that you have someone, a critique partner who is not only open to fantasy and enjoys fantasy, but understands the forms of fantasy and what a fantasy narrative needs to do. If you're writing something that might fall more into just a, you know, non-say genre specific fiction, then it's not necessarily that, you know, if you're writing about, you know, a novel about the Vietnam War, that you have to find someone who, you know, knows a lot about the Vietnam War necessarily, unless that's the critique you're looking for. You know, if you've written something historical and you're looking for feedback on the historical content of your book, then obviously you would want someone who has knowledge in that particular area. But I don't think it's absolutely necessary that your critique partner be specifically dedicated to the genre and form that you're writing in, because I think the hope would be that when your book goes out into the world, that it's something that can be read and, you know, embraced by people who read in a variety of different genres. So it can actually be helpful to have someone who is, you know, someone who necessarily doesn't read romance, but you've written a romance novel, but you're asking them to read it to see how it appeals to someone who's not steeped in the romance genre. So right. Either way, you know, I think you want someone who's sensitive to the genre you've written in, but at the same time, you probably want to appeal to a readership beyond just one specific genre.
And I almost think that that's also sort of where we distinguish between critique partner and then thinking again about like the beta reader or the person who's going to read it with the eye towards the genre. So I would say that I absolutely agree with everything you just said. I think ultimately it comes down to personality, that I would rather have a writer, not even personality, like I want to hang out with them, but more someone who I trust, who I've seen their feedback in other ways. Maybe you give some sample feedback to each other before you get into this crazy relationship, or you've just spent enough time with them talking about fiction or whatever it is that you're writing to know that they have, you know, opinions that you tend to not necessarily agree with everyone, but you see the logic in their way of critiquing, because ultimately I think writers in other genres can probably, you know, if they are good, if they understand the craft, there's potentially some areas where they could offer you feedback that might be really interesting and that you wouldn't get from only sharing with writers in your genre. But more than that, just find the person that you trust, right? Like that when they give you feedback, they're going to give you feedback that you're going to want to follow, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, at some level, it's a bit of a cliche, but good writing is good writing. And so if you have someone who's a good reader and understands what, you know, what good writing requires, they'll be a good reading of your work if they know how to give a good critique.
Well, and I think that there's a great point in the chat box, the idea that, yeah, for genre specific writing, you are absolutely going to have people read it with the expectations of the industry in mind. And I think as a writer, you just have to decide, is that something I also need from my critique partner? Or is my critique partner really the first person who helps me hone the craft of this? Meaning, you know, this character should be more developed. You lost me after this point because I didn't really see where this arc went and I was waiting for it to catch up. Like those things that are craft based, I think, does that critique partner have to be in your genre? You can make that decision that they do, and that's great. But yeah, if you're writing genre, I think you are going to be sharing your work with people in that genre as well at some point in your process for that exact reason. That's a great point that, you know, there's an expectation in the industry and from publishers.
Yeah, and I would add it doesn't have to be all or nothing. In the sense that, you know, if you've written a fantasy novel, you obviously wouldn't want to give it to someone who has told you, I hate fantasy, because you're probably not going to get productive feedback. But if you've written a fantasy novel and there's a romance in that fantasy novel and you're not quite sure if you've hit the right notes, it might be helpful to have someone who's a romance writer read your fantasy novel and then say, how do you think the romance is developed? And I know you're not necessarily an expert in fantasy, but you write romance. What do you think of the way I've developed the romance? So I think you can have certain specific kinds of responses from writers in different genres if you're curious about the way you've handled a certain genre aspect. Because I don't think any novel's actually ever purely just one genre,
Right.
but you're incorporating different genres in the same novel.
Well, and you know, the other thing that you touched on for a second there, which I think is also important, is if you are writing some sort of a book that taps into a particular area of expertise, or historical fiction that covers a certain era, or, you know, any number of things that, you know, having somebody who's actually an expert in that area read it and give you some feedback. You write a book called The Blind Astronomer's Daughter. I would assume at some point you probably I guess I'm curious, did you share it with an astronomer or did you share it with someone who knew Herschel, you know, Herschel's history? What did you do in terms of, or was that not a process, a part of your, you know, your beta reader or your critiquing process? And it was more just, you know, you did the research that made you feel confident that you had gotten it right.
You know, I relied on the research, and that's kind of a curious thing about doing historical fiction is that it wouldn't be enough to have, say, an astronomer read a book about 18th century astronomy. You would need to have a history of astronomer read that. So otherwise you could have things that were coming out incorrect in a completely different way.
Right.
So, you know, with that regard, I relied on readers who I trusted as good readers of fiction and not specifically experts in astronomy or experts in there was also a whole line about the Irish Rebellion of 1798. So I didn't have historians or astronomers read the manuscript. I had other writers who I just trusted, some of whom had written historical fiction, but who were just, you know, who I appreciated their work and saw them as good readers of fiction to read the work. And I sort of let the responsibility of historical accuracy and research accuracy fall on my shoulders.
Mm-hmm.
And look to them for advice on narrative and character development and plotting. So again, it depends on what you're looking for from a critique. In my case, I'm usually looking for craft advice and not so much research-based advice.
I also love what Sarah said. It's important it's important also to have subject matter experts. For example, if you're writing hockey romance, have a hockey fan read it. And that's a great suggestion. And I know I've known a lot of writers who write in the thriller genre who have a cop as their main character, and they ask someone who's a cop to read it and let them know, is there something in here that just doesn't sound plausible. So there's all sorts of things to think about when you're sharing your work, and thinking about what you need sounds like it's one of the first things you should do. Where do I find them? What's the best way to find a critique partner or group? How do you find critique partners and groups during this time of virtual socializing? John?
We're here.
It's so hard. And, in some ways, this is why we wanted to do this event, because we, as the Writers League, have realized, that it's something that a lot of writers are looking for, and that we want to do what we can to facilitate and help to make happen. But, I think, I'm just going to say in the simplest way, that the more you're putting yourself in situations where you're with other writers, and ideally, and someone else had this really great point earlier too, that you want writers at the same level as you, probably, or higher, I would say, that you're, by going to things like classes and by doing any sort of meetups that you can possibly find, I really think that is one of the key ways that you do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's important to think of it in terms of the long game, that what you're doing is building relationships, and that through meetings like this, through the monthly meetings or classes, you meet people, you start conversations, you take an interest in what they're doing, you ask them questions, they ask you questions, and then you work toward that point where you would, say, well, would you like to look at some of my work? Or someone offers that and says, if you ever, want me to look at something, I'd be happy to. But I think it's kind of hard to just look at it as a kind of cold call, where you're just looking for someone who you think might be a good reader, and then out of the blue, you write them and say, hey, will you read my manuscript? Because that's a big ask. So I think it starts, as you're saying, Becka, it starts here in these kinds of meetings, where you begin cultivating relationships with people, as writers, and you go from there.
I also think that it's interesting to think about the virtual part of it, because it is hard to, even when we're allowed to go into spaces with each other, it's still hard to find those right people. And I've known a lot of folks who've enjoyed exploring meetup groups, which you'll find them online, and then they do meet up in person. But there are a lot of those out there in the world. I'm not sure quite what they're doing right now, but also opening your mind to going into Zoom spaces and meeting writers who aren't in your backyard, who aren't in your town, who aren't even necessarily aren't even necessarily in your state, can be really freeing and open, to be able to widen the possibility of people. And so then it's a question of, are there ways to virtually socialize and virtually meet that'll allow you to have that opportunity? And I would say to anyone out there, if you have ideas, throw them in the chat box, because we're all ears. And I appreciate what Catherine's saying about having writers in your group who are less experienced than you. I hear you, absolutely. I think what I'm saying is probably that I would tend to agree with the idea that making sure there's not too much of a wide expanse between skill levels in terms of writing craft skill is probably a good idea. But again, this is all So subjective.
It's also helpful. I would, we've talked a little bit about the need to find someone who works in your genre, but also if you think way beyond your genre, one of my best readers in the last book was actually a playwright. Was a colleague of mine from where I teach at Spalding, who has never written a novel, but has a very good sense of narrative and structure. And she gave me some amazing notes on my last manuscript based from that kind of perspective, where she was looking at it sort of scene by scene and how things would be staged and what that would look like. So I think it's good to be open to the possibility that you might find a good reader who's actually, I'm assuming everyone here is, writing fiction, but you might find a great reader who's a screenplay writer, or who's a poet, or who's a stage writer, and is not necessarily a novelist.
Well, and we have folks here who are probably writing memoir or writing some sort of like narrative nonfiction. So you might even find someone who is a journalist who writes long form magazine pieces, or who can come at it from a different angle, but is also in the same kind of space. Here we go. I've been in critique groups for the last 7 years. I now have a small set who I trust. Each looks at my work differently. I'm traditionally published, but I'm looking for 1 or 2 additional critique partners who are higher level writers than I am. Are there any local sites or resources I can use to find them? So we're sort of brainstorming a little bit. When you're talking about specifically higher level writers, I'm guessing that might mean higher level in terms of their publishing experience and their number of books that they've published, since you're saying that you're also traditionally published. So one thing I would say is, if you're traditionally published, does your editor that you work with have writers that they think you might be a good match for, in terms of, getting to know each other in the first place? It's nice to have camaraderie between the same writers within an editorial group. But also, could there be one of those that would be a good partner? If you're traditionally published and you have a literary agent, the same thing. Are there clients in that agent's roster that would be excited to meet other clients on the roster who are writing fiction or nonfiction, whatever you might be writing, and see if they might be interested? I think that's one way to do it. And then again, going to, as many events as you can go to. And then I know a lot of folks are throwing things into the chat box that are giving some more ideas. Mm-hmm. How do you know that they're the one? I love this third comment. So, is the socializing attitudinal alignment period good? What does a healthy critiquing relationship look like? And it feels like a really good critique partner needs to be a really good fit with one's, oh, sorry, that's my email, guys. That happens every frickin' time. Sorry. Needs to be a good fit. And then the last point of that was, I don't want to be in a marriage. So John, what do you think about that question about, while I figure out my screen, what do you think about that question about the sort of how you know that it's a good fit?
Well, I think on a practical level, I've never asked anyone to read my work who I didn't already have a friendship or relationship with. And I've also never agreed to read anyone's work that I didn't already know, like know their work, had a friendship, had some kind of prior relationship with them. So I think it's difficult, unless you're talking about a kind of hiring someone, a professional that you're going to pay to read your work. I think in most cases, it's just kind of natural that this flows out of a prior relationship that you have with another writer. And I think that, finding someone who's the right reader depends on 2 things. You would want to know what their writing is. What does their writing look like? Do you respect them as a writer? Do you admire their work? Do you enjoy their work? And then thinking about, because that's probably the best sign of what they're going to be looking for when they're reading your work and how they're going to be critiquing it.
Yeah, like I think that's a really great point actually, that it's not just about, the one-way street of what are you gonna do for my work, but and will you enjoy reading what I've written, but also what, what do you write? And am I gonna enjoy taking the time to read your material and give feedback on it for sure. And even that phrase of, being respecting them as a writer, I think is a good thing to think about for sure.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing though that I would say for this, and I'm just going to go ahead and try to get back to where I was with the screen. Sorry guys, I'm the worst at sharing my screen. Is I think this does go back to, again, and we've talked about it, so I don't want to just, harp on it, but the idea of personality and just making sure that it's someone that you want to spend the time with and someone that you want to, that you can listen to, give you critical feedback and still feel good. If you're sitting in a writing group with a bunch of people and there's a writer there that you really respect as a writer and you love what they're writing, but every time they open their mouth to say something to someone else, your stomach turns because of just the way that they deliver it, then that's probably not your future critique partner. I know that sounds really obvious, but I have seen people get into relationships with folks because they just thought, oh, they're the type of writer I want to be, or there's someone I really admire, so I want to do this with them, but they weren't the right fit in terms of the way that they gave feedback or shared feedback. So communication style is also, I think, important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you need to remember that on the one hand, even though this is going to sound like it contradicts what I just said, that I usually have a prior friendship. I mean, I'm reading a manuscript right now by a friend of mine, but it's also a very professional kind of relationship. And so, once I know you've all heard this before, once you've put something on the page and you've put it out there, it's not yours anymore. It's on its own. It's got its own life, and the critique is not about you. It's about the work and about what you've written. And so I think it's important to have that kind of distance. So also so that the person you're asking to critique your work feels free and able to be honest with you about what is on the page.
I think that's a wonderful point. And it sort of leads us right into this idea of how do you handle feedback? Because it is, no matter who you are, it is not fun to receive criticism. And so even criticism that is meant in the most constructive way possible. So this was an interesting take on this question. So what if your critique partner gives you what seem to be excellent points and you can see how each one of their comments will enhance your novel, but another person who's got book trade experience says the way I wrote it is the best-selling point she'd ever seen. It feels like I'll have made an enemy of my partner and will need to find another who's not so critical. Please help with this angle. So really what this gets down to is, what do you do once someone, it's kind of skipping ahead past how do you take feedback. It's like, what do you do once you get the feedback? Are you supposed to make all of those changes? And I would love to hear you talk about this as an author, John, because I feel like that's one thing too that can get lost in the conversation is just because you have a critique partner and they go through your manuscript and they give you feedback does not mean that what they say goes, right?
Right, exactly. And from the other side, I've given feedback and critiques on many manuscripts, and I've never gone back to check to see if the writer actually took those changes or made those changes. It's not something that I follow up on. And so I wouldn't be at all insulted in any way if I gave someone feedback and they decided not to take it or not to follow it. It's something that I've never even, followed up on. So I don't know if, I don't know if that's something to really be worried about. I think that if when it's your manuscript, you are the author, you are in charge. And I think when you're asking someone for critique, you want to be respectful, of course, of their time and the energy that they're putting into your manuscript. But at the same time, they also need to understand that it's still your manuscript. And at the end of the day, it's your decision what you incorporate or what not. In the case like this question here, where you're sort of weighing the advice of a valued reader against the advice of someone with experience in the book trade, one of the hardest things about writing, of course, is that they can both be absolutely right. And so it kind of comes down to having to make that difficult decision of what do you want the manuscript to look like. And I would say, I don't see why you couldn't have a conversation with one or both of them individually about the different pros and cons of the changes that you're considering making to the book.
Yeah, I think this also brings up a few different things that maybe aren't even the intent of the person asking the question, but I like it. One of them being, yeah, do you have to take the comments that you get and make the changes? And of course not. It's your book. And in fact, more than that, I think if you reach a point where you make changes and you send something out in the world, and you get rejections, you're going to be kicking yourself and always saying, man, should I have made those changes? What if that's the reason why this happened? So at the end of the day, whatever you send out into the world should be the book that you feel is the best that book can be. And getting a critique partner to give you feedback is one way to do that. And talking to people who have experience in that genre or in the book trade is another way you can do that. But then you have to make those decisions. But I also think that it brings up the idea too of, too many cooks in the kitchen, and sort of how many people do you show your material to, because you might find yourself at the end of the day having 10 varying opinions on that material, and you might find that it's actually become so overwhelming that you're not sure what to listen to or where to go. So I don't know if you have any suggestions about that, John, in terms of just the number of people. And I would be curious, based on your experience of sitting in workshops where you can have up to 10 or more people reading the same material and giving feedback, how do you manage multiple points of view coming at you with differing opinions?
Well, what I tell my students all the time, and this is what I feel I've experienced as well, is that often when you get critiques, and especially in a workshop where you're getting 10 or more different critiques, often the critiques are responding to surface issues. And so I don't think there's any such thing as a wrong way of reading a manuscript, that there are productive misreadings. And so you may have people who respond to your manuscript in a way that they observe something or they make a comment, and you as the writer are thinking, well, no, that's not what I meant at all. But where that critique is helpful is to go beneath the surface and say, okay, what did I put in here that triggered that reading? Or if I thought I was being absolutely clear in this scene where the young boy's dog runs away, and yet there are 10 different responses to what is happening in that scene, it's not a matter of trying to figure out, well, which one of these responses are right, or which one of these responses do you take, but rather, why were there 10 different responses? What is it happening deeper in your manuscript that triggered or caused all of these different readers to have all of these different readings, which are all valid in their own way, even if it seems to you like it's a complete misreading and you can't figure out how anybody read your scene that way. That's how I look at those multiple readings. They're all very useful, because these are all different ways that readers responded to your work. Your hard work as the writer is now to figure out, why did they respond in that way? What is happening? What are the root causes in your story that caused that ambiguity?
That's great. And Tifo mentioned for the earlier comment that we were having, maybe ask why they thought a change might be needed, this idea of the two different people with the differing opinions. And I think that that's also something that you can do in that situation where you have 10 different people or 3 different people or whatever, getting clarification that once you receive whatever that feedback in whatever way you're going to receive it, being able to go back to that person and knowing that you have a relationship with them where they're open to that as well, and being able to clarify things is also important if that's the kind of relationship you want to have with the writer. Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. All right. We have not too many questions left, but let's see if I can figure out how to move this screen forward. There we go. The rest. So we have questions that aren't necessarily specific to critique partners, but how much weight should a new author give to building and maintaining a network of industry professionals? John Pipkin, over to you.
You know, I had the chat box open in a way that was blocking half the screen, and I saw the question, and I thought it was, how much weight should a new author gain? Well, like, before I actually like moved and saw what the whole question was.
So much weight.
I think it is, I'm going to split the question in half. I think it's very important to have a network to turn to. I don't know that they necessarily need to be industry professionals, depending upon how you're defining that phrase. I think it's very useful to have a network of people who are good readers, who are good writers. I mean, I know people who I trust their readings, even though they're not writers of fiction and or what I write. You know, I have friends who are academics who I trust, who are part of the network, who I think are very good readers in certain ways. So I do think it's important to have that network of other readers and writers. I don't think they all necessarily have to be industry professionals in the sense that they all need to be agents or editors. And also that is such a tumultuous industry. You know, I'm on my third editor now with 3 novels, and, you know, people that I worked with 10 years ago have moved on to other agencies or other publishers. And so even the idea that you would maintain a kind of regular kind of contact network among the publishing industry is something that would be very difficult to maintain.
Yeah, it seems like as a new author, the new authors that have developed networks that I've thought were the most valuable to them were the authors who were making connections with other authors and other writers, with, you know, going to readings and supporting other authors when they have books out in the same way that you're hoping someone will support you when your book comes out. And just being engaged in that part of it is, I think, can only help a new author. I don't think it has to be so much about how much weight. I think you have to see what you're comfortable with and what you enjoy. And certainly there are plenty of us who don't want to go out ever. I mean, now all I want to do is go out, but I think it's really helpful to connect with other authors. I think building networks of industry professionals usually comes further down the road in your career when you've actually been published and interacted with a number of different industry professionals. I want to go back actually to a question that was in the chat box, which was, sorry, this was actually dealing with critique partners again. It was that idea of, which is, I think, so valuable, asking specific questions when you give someone your manuscript so that you kind of, you know, you're not telling them they can't give you other feedback, but you're helping them hone in on the things that you're curious about. And I would imagine that might be something that you do, John, because you said you take it as far as you can take it. And so if you know you haven't taken it all the way, but you don't know quite what you want to do that, do you do that? Do you give people specific, like, tell me what you think of the sister, because I'm really not sure I've nailed the sister.
Absolutely not. No, I don't mean absolutely not. I will answer your question, but you know, that's a really interesting question, because I personally feel like I don't want to give anybody any direction when I give them my manuscript. And I also, and again, maybe this is really personal, but I also don't want to be told how to read. So in other words, I don't want someone, because I do, maybe I'm revealing too much. I do have people who will give me manuscripts, and then they'll start saying, all right, look, I know the beginning is kind of slow, and you know, I haven't quite figured out the ending yet, but what I really want you to focus, and at that point, I feel like, you know what, take it back.
Well, but that's not what I'm saying. I just want to differentiate. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying when someone hands a manuscript, this happens in my critique group often. Somebody hands a manuscript in and they say, you know, I can't wait to hear your notes. One thing that I am really struggling with is figuring out the relationship between these two characters, because I'm still not happy with it, but I'm struggling with it.
Yeah.
So when you're reading, if you could watch those characters and think if there's something that you see that might work, but it's definitely not like, I'm not suggesting that anyone would say, don't read this. I know there's still a lot to fix, as much as like, yeah.
I phrased that poorly because
You did, John.
I did. It's not because what you're talking about, which again, this is very sort of personal. I think that's a legitimate point to tell someone. Could you follow this particular aspect of the story? I don't give anybody direction at all of any kind, yeah. Even though I do have certain concerns about, you know, how is this working? Is this romance believable? Can you really feel this character's guilt? I just feel like it's always just about the writing. The writing has to speak for itself. Mm-hmm. And if there are flaws that are in the writing, it'll announce itself. And so I never want to do anything that's going to color a reader's reading or give them direction at all. I just want to give them
the that. Yeah.
You know, I just want to say, tell me, just read this. Because when when your book goes out into the world, you don't get to lean over the reader's shoulder and say, hey, pay attention to this part here. Or what do you think? I did a pretty good job here. What do you think? You know, like I sort of feel like at that level, when I'm giving the manuscript out, I just, you know, I have readers that I trust their feedback, and I trust them enough to know that if there are problems, they're going to find them. Mm-hmm. And if they don't find them, maybe there's not a problem there. But I don't give any direction at all when I give a manuscript. And I also, you know, I kind of don't, maybe people do give me directions, like, could you pay attention to this or this? But I also would rather be left alone to just read the manuscript on my own.
So let's flip it then. And this is a question that we have in the chat box as well. So what tips can you give? Because this relationship is, you know, give and take, and critique partner or critique group or any sort of exchange of pages, there's an expectation that you're going to take pages and read those at some point. So what tips do you give for that side of it, being the one to critique?
I mean,
how do you critique a manuscript well?
I think what a good reader does is to try to figure out what goals the manuscript has set for itself and whether or not it's reaching those goals, and what is it doing already that it's doing well, but it's not doing enough of. It's that I feel like when, you know, I tell my students all the time that, you know, I think about 90% of the time or 90% of the answers that you need to improve your manuscript are already in there. They just need to be brought more to the surface, and they need to be brought out. I don't think of critiquing a manuscript as bringing an external.
I'm losing you, John. Is anyone else?
The manuscript and seeing, does it do this? Does it do this? Oh.
I was losing you, but I don't know if it's me being lost or if you're the one being lost.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, you just froze for a while and then did a kind of max headroom thing.
Your hand is now frozen.
5 people know what I'm talking about. Right?
So I think that I think that's great advice. I think that idea of figuring out what the manuscript is, you know, what the writer is intending for the manuscript to do, and then if it's delivering what the promise is of the manuscript, if it's delivering on that promise, and then also things that you like that you wish there was more of.
I try to do what I was just talking a little while ago about the reader needs to do when you get 10 different responses, which if I'm like the manuscript I'm reading now, where I will see some problems happening with pacing in every scene, rather than treating it like you're a doctor kind of, well, maybe it is like being a doctor. You know, if you're noticing problems all over the body, you want to figure out what the cause is of that, rather than saying, here are 10 Band-Aids, put them on and now you're fine, right? You want to figure out what's causing these issues. And so So again, in the manuscript that I'm reading right now, I feel like the story has these great opportunities to make use of material that's already there, that it's not doing, but that, using that material could then provide more motivation for the main character, which then carries the character through the scenes that feel like they're lagging now. Rather than just giving a list of saying, okay, in this scene, the plotting's kind of slow, and in this scene, I wasn't quite sure where we were, and then in this scene, instead of going in a kind of itemized way, I like to look more for what the root causes are, and what things, again, the manuscript is already doing well. And often I think manuscripts will say, there'll be a little nugget or a kernel of brilliance in there that needs to be explored more, or needs to be sort of blown up to fulfill what the manuscript is trying to do.
And also, I think that leads to kind of a big piece of this as well, which is that would you agree that you're always going to lead, or you want to lead with some positive feedback, that you want to give the writer, if you're the one critiquing, you want to genuinely be able to bring to them the things that you feel have been done well in the story, and then everything that follows, anything that might be critical, is really in service of making it even better than it is. But meaning, it really sucks when you sit down with someone who's read your work and they just start by telling you the 5 things that they would change. And especially if they do it from the point of view of, well, if this is what I would change, and it's something kind of out of left field, because they're thinking of it as what they would have written, the story they would have written versus the story that you've written. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's a really good point about, here are the things I would change. I never make suggestions in my critiques. I never say, here's what I would do, or here's what this scene needs, or, have you considered maybe a car trip at this point in the story? Like, I never offer answers or suggestions, or mostly because I don't want to take ownership of the manuscript away from the writer. Mm-hmm. I feel like that every at vampires, right? Because part of that too is that maybe adding vampires is a brilliant idea, but now you've sort of robbed the writer of coming to that conclusion on their own. I would rather, I had a really wonderful experience with my first book. My editor was Janet Silver at Houghton Mifflin, and she only ever asked questions. She never gave me directions. She just asked leading questions like, does this scene really need to be 3 pages long? And it kind of like drove me crazy after a while. But I realized as part of what she was doing is, number one, leaving me the option to say, well, yeah, it does need to be 3 pages, but I better make it need 3 pages. Like, something needs to happen to make it be deserving of 3 pages. And it also, left me in charge. It was never a moment where I felt like I was losing ownership of the manuscript to somebody else who was making suggestions for what needed to be done. So I've always kind of incorporated that into my own feedback, both with students and with manuscripts, that I would never make a suggestion to a writer what they need to do. I would just, what I try to do instead, as I said, is figure out what the manuscript really wants to be doing, what it's already done, and where has it fallen short, and how could it do what it's doing well already, but do it more.
Mm-hmm. I like that. I like that idea of, and I think asking questions is really helpful for writers as feedback, because then they are forced to ask those questions, for themselves, and you're asking it from a point of view that is just a different angle. So I like it. That's great. That had nothing to do with industry professionals. Now this one is out of the topic, but can a personal memoir become too personal, making the reader go, ew? And I'll just answer this since you don't write memoir, John, and say that, look, people write memoirs about plenty of topics that might make any reader go, ooh, right? So I think this is a great example of having a critique group, a critique partner, someone you trust to share material with so that they can help you figure out if the delivery is keeping, is limiting the material or limiting the story. Meaning if maybe something in the book that is the way that it's been written is going to be off-putting so that people don't get the meat and the heart and the important part of what you want them to get. So, and again, like that's just having folks read it and help to give you feedback. There's no one answer to this question is what I'm saying. Like I remember reading Catherine Harrison's memoir when I was really early in publishing, starting in publishing The Kiss, which is her story of having a love affair with her father. And, you know, that's difficult material, and that's material that might make a reader go, ooh, but it was a real honest and true story that she wrote in a beautiful way. And so I think just having somebody read it and give you some feedback on how that ooh might be limiting you wouldn't be a bad idea. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm going to say there. Did you want to add anything, John? Probably not, right?
Oh, I would, because I have encountered this from the other side. Even though I don't write memoir, I've had memoir writers in critique groups or in workshops, and I think the bigger question there is whether or not you, as the writer of memoir, are ready for other people to critique it, because it's very personal, and as you said before, once it's on the page, it's its own thing. It's got its own life, and you have to be able to distance yourself from the manuscript and realize that any critiques of the manuscript are just about the manuscript and not about you as a writer or a person or your life. And memoir really makes that difficult because, of course, the life and the personal are very much close to the manuscript itself. But even still, when I've had students tell me, I want to give you something that's very personal, do you mind reading it? I actually just turn the question around and say, well, do you mind if I read it? Because I'm going to read this the way I would read any other manuscript, and I'm going to treat these characters like characters and the narrative like narrative. And so you as the writer have to be prepared for that level of criticism. That's not personal at all. It's just about the work.
I love that you said that. That's so true. That was good. Thank you. Any suggestions for introverts when it comes to creating meaningful writerly relationships? John? Find other introverts is what Tifo says.
We're like all introverts, are we? Like
Zoom. You want to be comfortable, but you want to find connection, and I do think that you can do both. It's just, if you're going to, I think Zoom has made it possible for writers to join large groups of people and remain very anonymous, because for sessions like this where you're not on camera but you could be in the chat box making comments, you're sort of having a little bit more of a safe space, right? So is it seeking out more opportunities like this? And then I've certainly seen over time folks in the chat box kind of connecting with each other directly over comments that they're making. And, I think that's it. I think it's finding the space where you feel as comfortable as you can feel, but you're still bumping up against other writers. And then looking within that space for people who feel like they might be someone you could connect with.
Yeah, it comes back to that earlier conversation about needing to establish relationships first before moving into the area of who am I going to ask to read my manuscript, who could I get in to be my critique partner. It's just about, reaching out and finding other people with similar interests. I'm just sort of assuming that the majority of us as writers are introverts because we like spending lots of time by ourselves writing. I think again, it just comes down to assuming that a lot of other writers are feeling the same way.
Yeah. I think someone's mentioning Twitter, and I agree that Twitter is a really cool place where there are writers who are extremely, popular, best-selling writers who are really engaged with their own feed on Twitter, and also on with people who comment on their feed. And then also you just might find other writers, here if you're in Texas, other Texas writers that you might have, a good time following, and that can at least maybe get you out of, feel like you're getting yourself out there in the world. I think Twitter also has its own, as we all know, drawbacks too, but for writers, I think it's true that there are some pretty great people saying some pretty fun stuff.
I think I revise too much for Twitter. I mean, I'll tweet something but spend a lot of time doing it and then think, well, I've tweeted, I'm done. But you're supposed to do it again and again and again. And
you need a Twitter critique partner. You can share your tweets with find someone to share your tweets with.
Every 10 minutes we're going to meet. So
every 10 minutes we'll meet, and I'll share my tweet with you. You share your tweet with me. Oh my gosh, guys, are you having the best time ever? So seriously, how do I find them? This was a question we had. I would love, and it's in the chat box too, I would love for WLT to help us find critique partners if there's a way to do it fairly and economically. There's always a way to do it fairly and economically. So ask and you shall receive. So for those of you who are members, you should have received your August member mailer today. And that included a survey in it that we'd love for you to fill out. And then we're gonna have our first ever virtual WLT member town hall on Monday, August 31st, the last day of the month. And the whole focus of this town hall is going to be that survey. And the focus of that survey is asking you guys what you're looking for in terms of whether it's critique partners, critique groups, writing partner, meaning someone you would meet with and write with, or a writing group, a group of people you might get together with and write with, but not necessarily share material. What you're comfortable with in terms of if that experience is online or if you want it to be in person at some point, to be determined. So I would just encourage you all to check out, look at that graphic, oh my gosh. On August 31st, if you're a member, it is a members event, and that's partly because what we're looking to do is develop another benefit for our membership, which will involve bringing writers together and helping them make these connections in a more very specific and strategic way. So I urge you to look at your email and consider that. That is the end of our questions, but I wanted to say if there's anything that you guys were wondering, I mean, I feel like you guys were doing an awesome job of also answering each other's questions in the chat box, which was great to see. So if there's something on this topic that that we can answer for you or talk about, or if there's anything else you want to talk to us about, you have a little time in the chat box. We'll sit here and just stare at each other. No, and wait to see if there are any questions. And if there aren't any questions, I just want to say a big thank you to you, John. It's always great to have you join in, and, being the executive director of the Writers League who started the summer writing retreat, it's great to have you here. But I think your perspective as a writer and someone who facilitates workshops and just a smart guy is always helpful. So thank you for doing this.
Thanks. It's always fun to be here.
Yeah, thank you guys. We are so glad you were here. We will see you next week for more fun and games, and I hope you'll check out the survey and let us know your thoughts so that we can try to bring you together. John had a critique outline he gave out at the retreat last year. Oh, John, you had a critique. Yeah. You presented at the retreat last year, right? I forgot about that. Oh, that's right. Guys, I hope you have a good night. I hope you have a great weekend. And I don't know. I hope all the best for all of you and for John Pipkin as well. John, where's your critique outline?
Oh, I can dig that up. And
I probably still have it. I think you gave it to me last year. Maybe would you mind if I just between you and me, would you mind if
yeah, sure,
I shared it with the I'll
If
share it with our sweet attendees.
Sure, but if you can't find it,
oh, I'll find it.
So are we on Twitter? Yeah, I'm on Twitter, but don't expect to see much. I don't know when the last time I actually put a tweet out there.
I'm on Twitter, but what's your handle?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, just John Pipkin.
Oh, really? You got your name and everything.
I jumped on early before.
Ooh, you were an early adapter, as they say.
Right, and I think there are about 10 tweets since then.
Yeah, I think I'm this. I'm not sure, but I think this is what I am on Twitter. I want to say I'm very funny on Twitter. Like awesome. I only have 65 followers, but they are some happy people, those 65. And I haven't tweeted in a while because I deleted it off my phone because I was just sick of like just looking at it too much. But you know, maybe I'll go back. I don't know, guys. Give me a reason. I'm a little punchy today.
Maybe I'll tweet something in the next couple of days. So I'll have to write a draft first.
You'll have to write a draft first. If you want to send it to me, I'd be happy to give you feedback.
Yeah, I want some notes on it before I
workshop your tweets. That would be a great. Who out there would take a tweet workshop with a Twitter workshop? But it would be a Twitter workshop, but it would only be 8 minutes long. Thanks, guys. Thanks for validating me and my Twitter, and thanks for being here. And we'll see you soon, John.
Yeah, good night, everyone.
Yeah, good night, John. I'll see you soon. Okay.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Good luck.
Bye. Bye. What do you?
Nope.
I thought you were.
I was
just gonna say to you, what are you doing?
Signing off.
See ya. Bye.